Hello and welcome back to English from the North, the podcast for learners of English with an intermediate to advanced level who want to enjoy their English with a little bit of a Scottish twist. My name is Lewis, and in today's episode, we're going to be having a look at accents. We're going to have a look at this idea of a standard accent and also have a look at this idea of a sort of a typical accent, because I need to tell you the truth about my accent. And the truth is that my accent, it's not a typical Scottish accent. Or is it? This is kind of the first thing that we're going to have a look at now. Because when it comes to Dundee, I've said a lot that, I live in Dundee, the city of Dundee in Scotland. Do I have a typical Dundee accent? No. Unfortunately not. I don't have a typical Dundee accent. I don't speak like a sort of your average person on the street in Dundee speaks. What does the typical Dundee accent sound like then? Well, the thing with the typical Dundee accent is it uses a lot more Scots words. It uses a lot more Scots expressions and things like that. So to give you an example, and this is, even for me, this feels a bit ridiculous because it's kind of it's not really who I am, but sort of your typical Dundee accent sounds more like this. You ken what I mean? It's more like that with Scots words and all this kind of things. And I'll try and put a wee transcript there in the transcription, because I know the AI that makes the transcripts is going to struggle with it. If it doesn't struggle with it, then that's definitely a sign that the AIs are going to, rise up and kill us all one day. But anyway, that's another thing aside. We'll see just how good the AI actually is. So that's what a typical Dundee accent sounds like. And as you can tell from my accent, it doesn't sound like that. That's not how it sounds for me. And I even feel a bit sort of, not uncomfortable, but it's not, it's not who I am. I can turn it on. I can speak like somebody from Dundee, but for me it feels a bit ridiculous because I don't sort of speak like that. And why I don't speak like that is something that we'll get into a bit later on. I said it's not a typical accent for Dundee, for my city. However, is it typical for my neighbourhood, my sort of town, village where I live? Yes, it is. Because to help you to understand, where I live, although I live technically in the city of Dundee, I live in a neighbourhood called Ferry, which historically was like a separate little town. It was like a little fishing town that was kind of separate from Dundee, and then over the years as Dundee's grown, it's kind of become part of the city, and now it is part of the city. And there are lots of people, lots of people in Dundee that say, well, Ferry, that's not Dundee. It's different, it's separate, it's the posh area. They say it's the posh area. In fact, I think a few years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, it was voted one of the nicest places to live in the UK. So there you go. But I don't want you to think it's too posh. I don't want you to think, actually, I don't want you to think it's posh, because okay, there are some posh bits, but to give you an example, I went to a high school in Ferry, and when I was 12 or 11, there was a boy in my year who was suspended and banned from certain departments in the school for throwing chairs at the teachers. And yeah, you heard that right. He literally picked up chairs in the classes and threw them at the teachers. So I think he was banned from modern languages, chemistry, things like that. And that was the best high school in Dundee. So you can imagine what the rest are like. But don't go thinking that Ferry is like sort of Kensington and Chelsea in London, because it is not. It's not that posh. Although it is a bit nicer than some sort of other areas in Scotland. So is my accent typical for sort of Ferry, that kind of area? Yes. Is it typical for Scotland in general? Well, that's when the concept of a typical accent gets a bit difficult to define, because when you talk about a country, when you get above a certain size, it becomes difficult to define. If we look at Scotland, what is a typical Scottish accent? I mean, for example, people in Glasgow have a very distinct accent. The Glaswegian accent's very distinct. And again, I'm going to try and imitate one, but the typical Glasgow accent can sound a bit more like that. It's a bit more almost nasally sometimes, when certain people talk with a Glasgow accent like that. That's not how they all sound. However, I hope the impression that you get is that, or hope what you hear is that it does sound quite distinctive. It does sound quite different. And it does sound quite different from at least the Dundee accent I tried to put on there. Is the Glasgow accent a typical Scottish accent? Well, how many people live in Glasgow? 1 million people? That's like 20% of Scotland's population. Glasgow is the biggest city after all. However, that's not the majority of people in Scotland. It's not even close. So do they have a typical Scottish accent? Well, not really, because like I've said, the Glasgow accent, it's very distinctive. It's very much its own thing, we would say. So we can't really think of it as being sort of representative of Scotland as a whole. And it's the same with other accents in Scotland, The Edinburgh accent is kind of more similar to mine, and again, it's the capital. But again, there's fewer people live in Edinburgh than live in Glasgow. So for the same idea, you can't claim that an Edinburgh accent is typical of Scotland as a whole. And that's the problem with typical accents, is that, well, this idea of typical accents, I should say, is that, you know, how do you define them once you get above a certain size? For a town, for a city, it's a bit easier. You will get some variation, like I've shown you with my own accent. But for talking about countries, it can be quite difficult to define. So you see that the idea of a typical accent is something that is quite difficult to kind of try and understand and things like that. And so when people talk about this idea of a standard accent, this is something that comes up quite often in language learning, and it kind of makes me want to tear my hair out. You know, I want to learn English with a standard accent. I want to learn Spanish with a standard accent. I want to learn French with a standard accent. Well, what is a standard accent? That's the problem. How do you define what's a standard accent? Because, like I've said, you know, looking at sort of typical accents, what's a typical Scottish accent? Well, there are multiple. So what's the standard Scottish accent? There isn't one, unfortunately. You know, there isn't one that you could easily pick. And it's the same for English from England. You know, there are goodness knows how many accents in English. You've got, you know, the Newcastle accent sounds very different to the Liverpool accent, sounds very different to the London even within London. Saying the London accent, there are about 5. You know, there are so many different accents. So choosing this quote-unquote standard accent is impossible. And the other thing about this whole concept of a standard accent that I think people really need to be careful with, that maybe you're not aware of, is that at least when it comes to English, well, I say English isn't English in the UK. Standard accents have a lot of problems related to classism. If you don't know what classism is, you know, like racism. Racism is discrimination against people based on their skin color or where they're from, that kind of stuff. Classism is discrimination against people based on we'd say their social class. We can use that word class to talk about a group of people in a school. We can also use the word class to talk about people's groups socially. And in the UK, there are sort of 3 main social classes. It's, you know, you've got your working class, you've got your middle class, and you've got your upper class. And at least historically, now it's a little bit harder. It's getting harder and harder to define what makes these classes, what you know, puts people in these classes. But at least historically, it was done based on your job, what kind of job you had. So a working class job would be a more sort of, we'd say, manual labor job, a hands-on job, working in a mine, working on a farm, working, you know, essentially with your hands, doing like, would say, low-skilled labor, you know, working in a supermarket, that kind of thing. A middle class job would be a job that you typically need to go to university for. So to be a teacher, to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, something like that, to be a manager, those kinds of things. And then an upper class job would be, well, upper class people don't really have jobs. Upper class people have money in the UK. So, you know, it'd be like the owners of the factory, the owner of a company, the king, the nobles, all this kind of stuff, you know. The higher up you go in classes, the less work you have to do, basically. The issue is that this concept of sort of standard accents and speaking properly comes from this sort of class system. Because if you think about it, who makes the rules in society? Well, it's the people at the top. Who are the people at the top? The rich people, the people who have power, the people who have money, and all this kind of stuff. So they make the rules. They speak in a certain way. Because in the UK, when you hear someone's accent, you can already make certain, people make certain presumptions about other individuals when they hear their accent. This is why classism is still a bit of a problem in the UK. Fortunately, it's getting better, but there are people that as soon as they hear someone's accent, they've already made decisions about how much money this person earns, what kind of area this person comes from, how intelligent they are, believe it or not, what kind of things they do in their spare time, what newspaper they read. It's nuts. It's nuts. Really it's terrible. Like I say, fortunately it is getting better, but historically it has been a big problem. So you have all these people who make these rules, who have all these presumptions about accents and things like that. The problem with accents in the UK is that, well, you can imagine, if you come from a working class background and you want to get a better job, you want to improve, you know, maybe your family had a sort of really hard jobs, but they've managed to raise enough money that you can go to university and you can study and you can get a better job and you can move on to sort of a more middle class job, for example. Well, issues that people like that have had historically is that they go into the interview and they start speaking, and before they've even said more than a few words, the people who are doing the interviewing, the managers, the bosses, who are of a sort of higher social class, we would say, they've already decided that this person isn't getting the job. because they don't like their accent. They've heard their accent, they've made these presumptions, and they've already decided it doesn't matter how good this person is, they're not getting the job. And like I say, fortunately this is getting better, but I know, for example, that even now there are certain jobs in certain sectors where someone like me with my accent has a better chance of getting the job than someone with, say, a typical Dundee accent. And that's terrible. Again, like I say, fortunately it is getting better, but it does still exist, and it is still a problem. So this is where this whole issue with standard accents comes from, is that it's these kinds of people at the top that make the rules. They decide, well, this is the standard accent, and it's almost like saying, this is the standard accent, therefore this is the correct way of speaking. This is the right way of speaking. There is a right way to speak English, and there is a wrong way to speak English. And that's false. I mean, it's not true. It's simply not true. There is no such thing as a right way to speak a language or a wrong way to speak a language. I mean, obviously with, grammar and vocab and using words in the right way, but you know what I mean. When it comes to accents, there is no such thing as a right accent or a wrong accent. And this is why this concept of a standard accent can cause problems, because it's rooted in a lot of these kinds of issues. You see it in other languages. In Spanish, for example, historically the Andalusian accent, which is quite distinctive, another good example of a very distinctive accent. It's very, very different from the accent from Madrid. Famously, people from Madrid say that they don't have an accent, which is always quite funny because yes, they do. But it's this kind of thing. Andalusian people faced discrimination in the past. For example, in Spanish movies, the character who was lazy or stupid or silly or, was the joke of the film, basically, was the one that spoke with an Andalusian accent. So you see that this kind of thing exists in other languages as well. And again, I've said it a bunch of times already. Fortunately, it is getting better, but there is still a ways to go. So how does this relate to your own learning, to the accent that you should choose? Well, you can probably guess what I'm about to say. Seeing as I've already said there is no such thing as a right accent or a wrong accent, then for you, choose the accent that you like. If you're learning English, you want to learn English with an American accent, go for it. You want to learn English with one of the many English accents, go for it. You want to learn English with a Scottish accent, go for it. It'll take a bit more work maybe than other accents, but absolutely, if you want to do it, go for it. I would say don't force it. Let it happen naturally. You can obviously work on it, and we're going to have a look at some techniques and things you could use maybe in the next episode or in another episode, looking at accents and things like that. But there is no right answer. There is no wrong answer. To give you a sort of personal example, my accent in Spanish is a mixture. It started off as being from Spain, sort of the Spain-Spanish accent, like I would say from kind of like Madrid, that kind of sort of central Spain kind of area. No real distinctive features, not like an Andalusian accent or anything like that. Because I was moving to Madrid and I was moving to Spain, so I thought, well, I should learn to speak sort of Spain Spanish. And I did that for sort of about 2 years or so. And then I last year really started listening to a lot of Argentinian music and things like that, because I'd done, like I say, comprehensible input with Dreaming Spanish, and I'd listened to an Argentinian accent for the first time, and I was like, wow, this sounds great. And I can't really explain why, but for some reason, sort of the Argentinian accent from like Buenos Aires, this Rio Platense accent, they would say, I find it very relaxing. I don't know what it is. I think it's to do with the certain sounds, the musicality, the intonation. There's a lot of intonation that I think people say comes from the fact that there was a lot of Italian immigrants to Argentina over the years, and the way of sort of speaking Italian kind of has given the Spanish there this sort of intonation and musicality and things like that. So it's absolutely fantastic to listen to. So I got more and more into it. I started listening to more Argentinian music and things like that, and then I was away in the Rugby World Cup in France in September of 2023. Met a bunch of Argentinians because one of the games I was going to see was Samoa versus Argentina. Was hanging out with them, and I was like, already really loving it. Really, really great people. And I decided to start taking lessons with someone from Argentina. So when I came back, I started taking lessons with Luna, who has her own podcast. It's Español desde el Sur. If you want to hear a podcast with a fantastic example of a Rio Platense accent, her podcast is definitely worth a listen. If you're learning Spanish, it's like I say, fantastic example of that accent. And so the effect that had with the music, with all these videos, with everything like this, is that my accent in Spanish now has a lot of features of Spain Spanish and also has a lot of features of Argentinian Spanish. for me, that's great. You know, I think it's great because it kind of tells its own story. It's a bit unusual because it's not standard. It's mixing these, you know, it's not a standard accent because it's mixing these features together. It's mixing different elements from different accents together. But it's sort of a reflective of how my journey with Spanish has been, and that's kind of, you know, the product of it all. And I think it's, like you say, it's something that's very unique. It's something that's kind of, for me, it's my own thing. So I guess the point there is that it doesn't really make a difference what accent you learn with. Just, you know, learn what you think sounds good. If you think a certain accent sounds good and you want to have an accent like that, go for it. You know, practice with it, adopt these kind of features, try and sort of mimic them and things like that. And if the other thing as well is, if you're not that fussed about having an accent, if you don't want to work 100% on having, you know, a perfect accent, that's something that comes up quite a lot with learners of other languages, is I want to learn to speak this language with a perfect accent so that people can't tell that I'm not a native speaker. That's fine. You know, if you want to do that, that's great. If you don't want to do that and you just want to, you know, be understood, then that's fine as well. I'm kind of more in the latter camp. I don't want a perfect native accent, but I'm happy to just have my accent changes, you know, as it goes. I try and follow sort of the pronunciation rules, making things that are pronounced properly, and let my kind of accent develop naturally. And as it has, it's developed this sort of weird Spanish Argentinian mix, which is, you know, like I say, I love it. I think it's fantastic. So in summary, you know, don't worry too much about which accent to take. Take the accent that you think sounds good. And if, you know, you're not fussed about accents, that's fine as well. Okay, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to accents. So I hope you enjoyed the episode for today. I hope that you got a nice little insight there into sort of the difference in accents and a little bit of backstory about my own accent. The link to the transcript is in the description. And before we go, just want to say as well, I am now on Ko-fi. If you like what you hear on the podcast and you want to support it, you want to help me to keep doing what I do, then feel free to toss me some spare change, you know, just send any spare change my way. The link to that in the description as well. So I think that about wraps it up for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.